When I got the alert that my garage lock had been cut, I raced home thinking it was just a petty thief. But when I saw Karen from the HOA towing my Jeep down the road like she owned it, I knew this wasn't just any theft, it was a mistake that was about to change her life forever. She had no idea that the Jeep belonged to an undercover federal task force, and she'd just turned her petty HOA power trip into a federal crime. The morning had started like any other. The sun rose quietly over the neatly trimmed lawns of Brook Hollow Estates, a gated suburban neighborhood where perfection wasn't just encouraged, was demanded. Every house had a fresh coat of paint, every flower bed was perfectly mulched, and every trash bin disappeared within 20 minutes of garbage pickup. It wasn't enforced by common courtesy. It was enforced by Karen Langford, the HOA woman who treated the community like her private kingdom. Karen wasn't just the head of the homeowners association. She was the HOA. She took it upon herself to inspect every mailbox, every driveway, every lawn edge with the intensity of a military drill sergeant. People joked she could spot an unapproved patio umbrella from 2 streets away. She was always around, driving her beige Lexus SUV, clipboard in hand, ready to issue violations to anyone who dared defy the sacred code of uniformity. Some people feared her, others hated her. Most just stayed out of her way. I had always kept a low profile. In the neighborhood, I wasn't much for socializing, didn't show up to block parties or barbecues, and kept to myself. It wasn't because I didn't like people, it was because I couldn't afford distractions. By trade, I worked in federal law enforcement, a task force that operated under a joint agency umbrella. Most of our work was deep cover surveillance, tracking high-level targets through months of operations. It wasn't the kind of job you talked about in your front yard while watering the flowers. The HOA didn't know who I really was. On paper, I worked for a nondescript federal logistics division and commuted irregularly. That was enough to keep questions away. But I did submit a special clearance notice months ago, informing the HOA that a vehicle in my garage would be temporarily exempt from community registration requirements. The vehicle was a white Ford or Jeep Cherokee military-grade tracking gear embedded in the frame, reinforced engine block, long-range surveillance antenna built into the roof rails, and no license plates for operational reasons. It sat locked away in my garage, covered in off-limits. That Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a federal asset. I assumed the HOA would honor the paperwork. I assumed wrong. That Saturday morning, I was an hour away from Brook Hollow conducting a quiet drop with another agent. I remember the moment clearly. I was sipping black coffee at a roadside diner, double-checking our notes before the target was due to arrive. My phone buzzed, a small vibration, nothing loud. I looked down. It was an alert from my home security system. Garage lock tampered, motion detected, visual feed activated. I tapped the alert and the live stream popped up. What I saw made me go ice cold. Karen, standing right outside my garage, in her cargo vest and wide-brimmed visor hat, squinting at the padlock like it had personally offended her. Behind her was a tow truck, yellow and rusted, not one of the city-authorized units. A younger man, likely the driver, had bolt cutters in hand. 2 other HOA board members stood a few feet away, arms crossed like they were there to enforce the neighborhood constitution. The feed didn't have audio, but Karen's lips were moving fast. She was pointing at my garage, gesturing wildly, and then snapped the bolt cutters, bit clean through the padlock. It stood up so fast, my chair tipped over. I threw cash on the table and was out the door in seconds, calling dispatch as I ran to the car. "This is Agent Maxwell. I've got an emergency at my home address. Code red. HOA civilian has breached federal property. Asset compromised. I need immediate response at Brook Hollow Estates, 147 Deer Ridge Lane." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. "Copy that, Agent Maxwell. Units en route. ETA 22 minutes. But I wasn't waiting 22 minutes. I hit the gas, weaving through traffic like my life depended on it. My mind raced. That Jeep contained encrypted files, backup hard drives, tracking nodes, sensitive data about an open investigation into a cartel-linked network. It didn't matter if Karen thought it was an abandoned vehicle or an eyesore. It was a federal vehicle under protection. Cutting that lock wasn't just vandalism. It was a felony. She had no idea the depth of the mistake she had just made. As I neared the neighborhood, another notification buzzed. Vehicle movement detected. Garage door opened. I pulled into Brook Hollow like a storm. As I turned onto my street, I saw my garage wide open, empty, the Jeep already gone. I slammed the brakes and jumped out, heart pounding. Neighbors had come outside, drawn by the commotion. One of them, an older man named Tom who lived 2 houses down, walked up looking nervous. "She towed it," he said, shaking his head. "Karen said it was violating HOA code. No plates, garage clutter, something about junk vehicles not being stored on property." "Did she say where it was going?" I asked. "I think she said her cousin runs a scrapyard off Miller's Highway." I didn't respond. I turned and bolted for my car again. I called it in as I drove. "Vehicle has been taken. Suspected location, Miller's Highway, scrap and auto. Jeep Unit 9 FJ349. Do not allow entry to crusher or dismantling bay. Repeat, Do not allow dismantling. This is a national security matter. Understood. Air and ground support en route. The drive felt like hours, but it took only 12 minutes. I pulled in just as the tow truck was lowering my Jeep onto a hydraulic lift behind the scrapyard's main shed. Karen was there, clipboard in hand, arguing with a stocky man in grease-stained overalls, probably her cousin. She waved her arms, like she was the queen of suburbia giving away prizes. She didn't see me at first, but she did notice the 3 black SUVs that pulled in behind me, and when 4 federal agents stepped out, vests and badges in full display. The color drained from her face. I walked up to her slowly. You cut a federal lock. You removed a classified vehicle. Do you have any idea what you've done? Karen opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. This vehicle was unregistered. It violated HOA rules. I posted 2 warnings. Karen, I said, voice low and cold, you just stole federal property. That vehicle is part of an active task force operation. And now it's been moved, tampered with, and almost destroyed. The other agents didn't wait. They took her clipboard, her phone, and read her rights while she stammered about just trying to clean up the neighborhood. The tow driver was detained. The cousin to one of the agents found my Jeep's hidden console pried open. Another agent climbed in and ran diagnostics. Tracking systems intact, he called out, camera feeds are frozen but data appears secure. I took a deep breath. Close call. Karen, now cuffed and sitting on the concrete, looked up at me with wide panicked eyes. You didn't put a sign. You didn't say it was federal property. I did. I said you just didn't care, and that was the problem. Karen had gotten away with so many power trips that she thought she was above every rule. But now, her obsession with control had crossed the one line you don't ever cross, messing with federal operations. I turned back to my Jeep, the back bumper still bearing the scrape marks from the tow chain. I'd get it repaired. But the damage Karen had done to herself was irreversible, and this was only the beginning. The morning after Karen's arrest, the air in Brook Hollow Estates was noticeably different. Quiet, heavy, uncertain. For once, there were no HOA patrols. No pastel notices pinned to garage doors. No emails from Karen warning residents about illegal bird feeders or unauthorized wind chimes. The queen of rules was gone and nobody quite knew what to do about it. The news had traveled faster than wildfire. It didn't help that someone, maybe one of the neighbors or a tow yard employee, had filmed the arrest and posted it online. The video wasn't long, but it was clear. Karen, in her HOA vest, being placed in handcuffs by 2 serious-looking federal agents while she barked, "I was doing my job." The video was titled, HOA President Arrested After Towing a Fed's Jeep, and within 12 hours it had racked up over 300,000 views. People were tagging their neighbors, their own HOA boards, even journalists. Karen had become an internet villain overnight. I stayed indoors that day, not out of shame or fear, but because protocol demanded it. Anytime an undercover asset is compromised, especially in such a public and reckless way, we're placed on standby until an internal security review is completed. My supervisor had already called that morning. We've got teams reviewing everything. Gear from the Jeep's been recovered, but we're scrubbing data to confirm there wasn't any unauthorized access. You did good by reacting fast. Still, this case is getting eyes from higher up now. DHS wants a report, so does Doge. Let me guess, I said, sipping my coffee. They're wondering how a suburban housewife managed to compromise federal property. Exactly, he replied, with a tired sigh. They want to know if this is about oversight or arrogance. Oh, it's definitely arrogance, I muttered. Later that afternoon I heard a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, I saw James Bennett, one of the quieter HOA board members, middle-aged, always wore loafers, and rarely spoke at meetings, unless asked. He stood there looking nervous, holding a folder under one arm. "Hey, can I talk to you?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table. He set the folder down between us. "I don't know how much you know about Karen's operations," he began, "but some of us on the board were getting concerned. She started making decisions without meetings, authorizing citations, approving expenditures, even hiring contractors we never voted on." I raised an eyebrow. "So why didn't anyone stop her?" He shifted uncomfortably. "She threatened. People quietly said if we opposed her we'd get cited for code violations. One board member had their lawn dug up for a soil inspection after they disagreed with her. Another had their mailbox vandalized 2 weeks after voting no on a policy change. We couldn't prove anything, but we knew." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, internal memos, HOA violation slips with forged signatures, and most damning authorization forms that Karen had signed herself, claiming unanimous board approval. The most recent was for the tow of an unregistered vehicle at 147 Deer Ridge, which she claimed was abandoned and suspected stolen. The form had 3 signatures. 2 of them belonged to board members who had resigned months ago. "This is enough for federal forgery charges," I said, flipping through the stack. James nodded. "We didn't know she was going this far. The Jeep thing. That was the final straw. I want to help, whatever you need." I didn't say it out loud, but this was what I had hoped for. Karen's downfall wasn't just about a stolen Jeep. It was about exposing the abuse of power that had plagued our neighborhood for years. With James' cooperation, things could unravel even faster. By the end of the day, I had handed the folder over to our task force's legal team. They were stunned by the level of manipulation. Karen hadn't just violated federal law, she'd turned an entire neighborhood into her personal dictatorship. And now, that empire was falling apart. The next few days were chaotic in the best way. Residents who had once whispered complaints were now speaking up. Complaints flooded the HOA's temporary inbox. People began showing up at the community center demanding special meetings, budget transparency, and a vote to remove the remaining board members who had stayed silent during Karen's reign. Even the local news caught on. A reporter showed up at the gates one morning and interviewed neighbors on camera. One woman said, "I got fined $300 for having the wrong shade of mulch. Karen mailed me a color swatch and said it clashed with the community aesthetic." Another neighbor admitted he had replaced his perfectly functional fence just to avoid constant inspection threats. The media attention made things move faster. The county inspector's office launched a review of HOA activities. The Department of Justice initiated a formal complaint against Karen for federal interference, misuse of private property, and forgery. A hearing date was set for 3 weeks out. Karen, now out on bond, was reportedly holed up in her sister's house in another county. No one had seen her since. I finally had some breathing room to assess the damage. My Jeep had been fully inspected and cleared by internal security. Fortunately, most of the hard data was still secure, but the trust, that invisible wall that keeps undercover work safe, had been fractured. I knew I'd be reassigned soon. Brook Hollow was no longer viable for low-profile operations. Still, I didn't regret what happened. I was out walking my dog when an elderly couple stopped me. I had seen them around before, quiet, private people. The woman smiled softly and said, "We've lived here 12 years. Thought about moving more than once because of how things were run. But what you did, what you exposed, thank you." It was strange. I had always worked in shadows, doing good behind closed doors, making a difference no one could ever thank me for. And now here I was, getting gratitude not for some classified arrest, but for standing up to a suburban tyrant with a clipboard. A few days later, an emergency HOA meeting was held. This time, it wasn't in a small boardroom. It was in the park, in broad daylight, with over 150 residents in folding chairs. James stood at the front with a microphone and laid everything out: Karen's forged forms, the unauthorized fines, the fake citations, the harassment. He didn't hold back. Then came to vote. A full HOA recall was approved by overwhelming majority. Not only was Karen officially removed, not that she could come back, but the entire board was dissolved pending re-election. Residents cheered, some cried. A woman even brought cupcakes with "by Karen" written in red icing. For the first time in a long time, Brook Hollow felt like a neighborhood again. As I walked back home, my phone buzzed. It was my supervisor again. "HQ wants you reassigned to a new location," he said. "Your cover here is blown. You'll get the details soon," I figured. I said, "Brook Hollow's had enough federal drama for one lifetime." "Yeah," he chuckled. "But what you did here, that was more than just protecting an asset. You stood up for a whole community." I hung up and looked back down the street. Kids were riding bikes, people were laughing. Someone had put up a swing in their front yard. Unapproved one, but no one seemed to care. The HOA crown had fallen, and Karen Langford, she was about to find out what real consequences looked like. Karen Langford had always seen herself as the judge, jury, and executioner of Brook Hollow Estates. She gave orders, handed down penalties, and destroyed reputations with nothing more than a printed citation taped to a front door. But inside the cold, windowless interrogation room of the federal building downtown, Karen didn't look like royalty. She looked like a woman who had just realized her empire wasn't made of stone, it was made of glass. And she'd walked straight through it. I wasn't in the room with her. That wasn't my place. But I had access to the footage. As part of the task force, I was permitted to observe her statements and help piece together her motives, connections, and any deeper wrongdoing. We weren't just looking for answers about the Jeep theft anymore. We were investigating the possibility that Karen had used her HOA role for more than just power trips like financial gain, unlawful surveillance, or even political influence. The room was quiet. Karen sat in a steel chair, hands folded tightly, eyes flicking between the two agents seated across from her. One was Agent Dorsey from DOJ Internal Affairs, the other Agent Ramirez, a no-nonsense DHS officer who'd seen people far more dangerous than Karen crack under less pressure. They weren't aggressive. They didn't need to be. Karen was already unraveling. "I was just enforcing the rules," she said for the third time in under 10 minutes. "The vehicle was unregistered. It violated Section 8B of the HOA agreement. I have full authority to order a tow, even if that vehicle is locked inside a private garage," Ramirez asked calmly. With a federal-issued padlock and multiple notices filed to the HOA about its clearance, Karen blinked. I never saw any clearance notice." Agent Dorsey slid a copy of the document across the table. It was dated 3 months earlier. signed and time-stamped, sent via certified mail to the HOA board, and digitally acknowledged by none other than Karen Langford. Her signature was right there. "That's not mine," she said immediately, but her voice trembled. "You're saying someone forged your signature?" She hesitated. "No, I mean I must have been rushed. I sign dozens of things every week. I don't remember every document." "That's convenient," Ramirez said. "So let's back up. Why target that specific property? Why not just issue a citation? Why tow the vehicle without board approval?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Her mind was working, scrambling for a way out, but the walls were already closing in. The agents knew about the forged forms. They knew about the fake board approvals. They had testimonies from other board members, residents, even the scrapyard owner. All of it painted the same picture. Karen had become a tyrant who believed she was untouchable. "I did it for the good of the community," she said finally. "That vehicle had looked suspicious. I thought it could be stolen. Maybe a gang car. No plates, just sitting there for weeks. I was protecting the neighborhood. You didn't call the police. You didn't report a suspected stolen vehicle. You didn't even contact the homeowner," Dorsey replied. "You ordered a private tow truck off the books and had the vehicle dumped at a relative scrapyard. That's not protection. That's premeditated theft." Karen's masks cracked. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Her eyes lost their sharp edge, and her confidence dissolved like sugar in hot water. "I was just trying to make things better," she whispered. "Better for who?" That was the question while Karen was being interrogated. The forensic accounting team was going through the HOA's financials. What they uncovered surprised even me. There were tens of thousands of dollars in unaccounted maintenance fees. Over the last 2 years, line items labeled as emergency landscaping, security upgrades, and legal consulting, all with no receipts and no confirmations. Payments had been funneled through shell contractors, small companies created and dissolved within months. Most of the money had gone to accounts connected to Karen or her relatives. It wasn't just power, it was theft, suburban embezzlement, hiding in plain sight. That same day I was called in by my supervisor to review the growing list of federal charges being built against her: theft of federal property, obstruction of justice, forging government documents, misuse of authority under civil code, and now I have fraud and embezzlement. What began as a petty HOA incident had exploded into a full-scale investigation. "I've seen cartel fronts cleaner than her books," my supervisor muttered as he handed me the report. Meanwhile, back in Brook Hollow, residents were starting to understand the scope of what had happened. At first, they were shocked that the woman who fined them for mailbox height was now facing federal charges, but as more stories surfaced, that shock turned into anger. A family who had their backyard swing set removed without notice came forward, revealing that Karen had threatened to fine them $1,000 unless they tore it down themselves. A single mother showed emails where Karen denied her requests for a fence permit multiple times while allowing the same fence style for her personal friends. Another man shared that he was fined $500 for leaving his trash cans out 10 minutes too long, and was charged an additional $200 for administrative handling. People had been bullied, extorted, some had even moved away to escape her, and the most heartbreaking story came from the Andrews family, who had received multiple violation letters for having their elderly father's wheelchair ramp visible from the street. Karen had claimed it was visually disruptive. The family had to fight for months before being allowed to keep the ramp. Now, that same family was preparing to join a civil suit against her. "I was at home when I got a call from Agent Dorsey. She cracked," he said simply. Karen had signed a partial confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was offering full cooperation: names, documents, emails, even passwords to HOA systems that had been locked down. She admitted to forging signatures, falsifying board votes, and siphoning funds into private accounts. She claimed she did it because no one else would lead, because she believed she was fixing the community in ways no one else could. That was the tragedy of Karen Langford. Somewhere along the way, she stopped believing in fairness and accountability. She believed the rules didn't apply to her anymore. And for a while, they didn't, until she cut the wrong lock. The next few days moved quickly. The Department of Justice filed official charges. The HOA was placed under third-party management. A temporary board was appointed by the county, and Karen, she was officially indicted and awaiting trial, facing a list of charges long enough to take an hour to read in court. Brook Hollow began to heal. You could see it in the way neighbors started waving again. Kids played on front lawns without fear of noise complaints. People actually smiled as they walked their dogs. And in an odd way, the Jeep became a kind of legend, a symbol of what brought the tyranny down. One evening, I stood at the edge of my driveway watching the sunset paint the houses in golden rows. Tom, the neighbor who had warned me about the tow, came over with 2 beers. "You know," he said, handing me one, "I always thought she'd slip up one day. Just didn't think it'd be over your Jeep." I smirked. "Me neither." We sat in silence for a while. Then he added, "You sticking around?" I shook my head. "They're moving me to another district. Once something like this goes public, it's hard to stay low profile." "Well," he said, raising his bottle in a quiet toast, "thank you for everything." As we sat there watching the neighborhood return to life, I realized something. My job had always been about protecting the big-picture national threats, major cases, high-level but sometimes, the biggest victories are the smallest ones, like freeing a neighborhood from a dictator with a clipboard, like returning power to the people who'd been too afraid to speak. Karen thought she ran everything, but she forgot the one rule that matters most: you can't control what doesn't belong to you. And that Jeep, that lock, it never belonged to her. A week after Karen Langford's formal indictment, Brookhallow Estates began to resemble something it hadn't been in years: a neighborhood. Not a battleground for ridiculous citations. Not a chessboard ruled by an HOA president with delusions of power. A real neighborhood where people started putting up porch swings, letting their kids chalk the sidewalks, and chatting with neighbors without glancing over their shoulder to make sure Karen's SUV wasn't parked nearby with a camera for her own. But just because she was gone didn't mean the storm had passed. Inside our downtown field office, things were moving fast. The DOJ was assembling their case, while forensic analysts were pulling every thread they could find in Karen's digital life. Emails, text messages, burner accounts, HOA board chats, everything was being traced. And what we were uncovering wasn't just petty misuse of authority, it was calculated, systematic, and it reached deeper than we thought. I was pulled into a briefing room with my supervisor and 2 federal auditors. The screen lit up with a map of Brookhallow, dotted with pins, each one representing a case of a resident fined, threatened, or targeted for mysterious HOA violations. Some pins were green, some yellow, and a few red. The red ones, those were homes that Karen had attempted to lien for failure to comply with neighborhood standards. And what made them stand out wasn't the violations, they were all fake. The owners, retirees, single parents, widows, and people who had either recently divorced or were in foreclosure limbo, vulnerable targets. Looks like she was setting them up, one of the auditors explained. Issue phony citations, hit them with massive fines, and when they couldn't pay, start legal proceedings to seize their property. Then she'd either threaten a lien or offer to settle for less, usually buying the property under a trust name at half market value. She was flipping properties, I asked. Not just flipping, she was laundering HOA funds into those transactions through shell buyers and selling them off to developers outside the community. The numbers were staggering. Karen had profited well over $300,000 in under 3 years using this method, and no one had seen it, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because people didn't know what to look for. She had hidden her moves under the guise of community enforcement, backed by vague bylaws and a culture of fear she'd spent years building. My Jeep may have been the thing that finally triggered her collapse, but now we were uncovering the real foundation she'd built her little empire on: greed. That afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, not as a federal agent this time, but as a witness gathering final notes for the DOJ. There were 6 specific properties they wanted me to check. All of them had been part of Karen's target pool. I spoke with the owners, those who still lived there, and what I heard was a pattern of the same horror story. "She'll find me for having the wrong shade of blue on my shutters," said Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly widow who had lived on the corner lot for 20 years. Said it was disruptive to the visual harmony of the block. Then she hit me with another fine when I didn't repaint them in time. I had a broken hip. I physically couldn't do it. A young single father down the street told me that he was threatened with legal action for having a basketball hoop on the edge of his driveway. I told her my son only plays for an hour after school. She said it violated play structure compliance and slapped me with a $200 citation. Every story had the same undertone. Karen had targeted people who she thought couldn't or wouldn't fight back, people without the resources or energy to hire lawyers or appeal. When I returned to the office and reported everything, Agent Dorsey nodded grimly. She wasn't just drunk on power. She was running a silent scam under the flag of neighborhood management. The DOJ added 3 more charges to her case: real estate fraud, elder exploitation, and criminal misuse of nonprofit funds. And that's when something happened that no one expected. Karen turned. Her attorney reached out with a message. Karen was willing to name others involved. I was in the conference room when the video link opened. Karen looked different, pale, thinner, dressed in a plain gray sweater instead of her HOA blazer. Gone was the woman who strutted through HOA meetings like she owned the world. This was someone who had lost everything and knew it. "I'll cooperate," she said without even being prompted, "but I want a reduced sentence. And I want my family kept out of this." The agents didn't blink. "Depends on what you give us." And give us she did. She started naming names. Contractors who had paid her under the table for exclusive neighborhood jobs. Former board members who had helped forge votes. A cousin who had handled dirty accounting. A city clerk who had flagged foreclosures for her before they were made public, so she could move in fast with legal threats. She even provided access to a burner email account she'd used for off-record communication. That account alone contained damning records, negotiations, scanned checks, even audio files. It was enough to make the DOJ smile. That same week, federal marshals executed for more arrests, one of them being a city employee. Brookhallow wasn't just a victim of one woman's arrogance. It had become a playground for low-level corruption, and the shock was spreading. The county opened a task force to investigate other HOAs with similar structures. News stations began doing exposes on the HOA queen who went too far. People who had never questioned their own neighborhood rules started checking who really held the power behind their gates. I thought I was done with the case, but it wasn't done with me. One evening, while packing boxes for my relocation, I received a call from Karen's attorney. She wants to speak to you. Off the record, I hesitated, then agreed on one condition. It had to be in person and monitored. They brought her into the interview room with 2 agents present, but they stood back. She looked at me, then down at her hands, fidgeting with the fabric of her sleeves. Never meant for it to go this far, she said softly. I didn't reply. I started with good intentions. The HOA was falling apart. No one wanted to take responsibility. The landscaping contracts were corrupt. People were ignoring the rules. I tried to fix things, but it felt good. Having control. That's the problem, I said. It felt good to you, but to everyone else, it felt like prison. She nodded slowly. I thought no one would notice or care. Well, I said, standing up, you were wrong. That was the last time I saw her. Karen pled guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release. She forfeited nearly $500,000 in assets. Her name was stripped from every HOA document she'd ever signed. Procolo moved forward. A new board was elected this time with checks, transparency, and public input. The HOA were rewritten by legal professionals, reviewed line by line by the community. People felt safer, stronger, freer, and I transferred to a quieter assignment in a different part of the state. Smaller town, less drama. But every so often I'd drive past a neighborhood with clean streets and identical homes and wonder who's really in charge here. Because I learned something in Brook Hollow. Power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a smile and a clipboard and thinks that makes it king. But no one is above the law, not even a Karen. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Karen stepped up to the defense table. She looked nothing like the arrogant HOA president who once strutted through the neighborhood handing out violations like candy. Her once perfect blonde bob was frazzled. Her business suit hung awkwardly, and the smug grin she wore when she had my Jeep towed was long gone. She stood in silence as the federal judge scanned over the thick file of evidence against her: sworn statements, GPS logs, surveillance footage, and recordings that painted a crystal-clear picture of a woman who thought her HOA badge gave her unlimited power. Weeks of legal back and forth had led to this moment. After her arrest, Karen had tried everything, claiming ignorance, blaming the tow company, pretending she thought the Jeep was abandoned. But the prosecutors weren't buying it. They had built a rock-solid case around the facts. She cut a lock, unlawfully entered a private garage, seized federally protected equipment, and nearly destroyed it in a salvage yard. They also uncovered a string of similar enforcements she'd conducted in the past, harassing neighbors, fining people for minor infractions that weren't in the bylaws, and even pocketing money from some of the citations. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a power-drunk tyrant. The prosecution's closing argument was short, powerful, and left no doubt. This defendant weaponized her role as HOA president to exert control over a community, and in doing so, committed crimes that interfered with federal law enforcement operations. This was no misunderstanding. This was theft, trespassing, and obstruction, and it almost compromised a national investigation. I sat in the courtroom, arms crossed, watching silently. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile, but I did feel something shift inside me as I looked around the room and saw so many neighbors who had once been afraid of her. They were here now, watching justice unfold. Karen's downfall had become a community reckoning, and for many of them, this was the first time they had truly seen how deep her abuse of power ran. Karen's lawyer gave a last-minute plea for leniency. He painted her as someone who simply made a mistake, a woman overwhelmed with HOA responsibilities who had been trying to beautify the neighborhood. But the judge wasn't moved. He adjusted his glasses, looked over the courtroom, and delivered a verdict that would be remembered for years. Karen Summers, he said, voice calm but resolute, this court finds you guilty on all charges. You have not only trespassed and destroyed property, but you've interfered with a federal operation. You used your position as HOA president not to protect your community but to control it. Your behavior was reckless, dangerous, and criminal. Gasps echoed from the back of the courtroom. Karen's face turned pale. I hereby sentence you to 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are also barred from holding any community leadership or property management roles for 10 years. This court will not tolerate abuse of power, especially when it puts others in harm's way. Karen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, stunned, as the bailiff led her away in cuffs. I watched her go, a mixture of relief and justice finally settling in my chest. She wasn't the first HOA president to take things too far, but she might be one of the first to learn the hard way that the rules apply to everyone. With Karen gone, the HOA board was left in shambles. Investigators had already begun auditing their financial records. 2 more board members stepped down after being questioned. about their role in authorizing illegal fines and shady contracts. Within a month, the HOA was dissolved under court order and a new, independent committee was formed, this time with oversight, transparency, and actual neighborhood input. The new committee reached out to me shortly after, asking if I'd be willing to help them draft a set of bylaws that respected privacy, rights, and the law. I politely declined. I told them I was happy to advise if needed, but I had a job to get back to, a real one. The kind where you wear a badge and uphold the law, not bend it to your personal will. My Jeep was returned to me the day after the verdict. It had some scratches and minor damage, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The agency covered the costs, and my tech team restored all the embedded systems and wiped anything that might have been compromised. We were lucky if Karen had crushed it like she planned. It could have delayed operations by months. It could have hurt people. I took that as a lesson, too. Sometimes, danger doesn't wear a mask or hide in a warehouse. Sometimes, it wears a name tag and sits behind a desk in a suburban HOA office. Over time, the neighborhood shifted. Without Karen's constant surveillance, people relaxed. Kids played outside again. Neighbors waved instead of peeking through blinds. The fear that once hung heavy over every lawn decoration and parking violation slowly faded. People started meeting, talking, and building real connections. The community found healing in her absence. One evening, as I returned home from work, one of the neighbors, Mr. Randall, a retired firefighter, walked up to me with a bottle of bourbon and said, "Thanks for keeping your cool through all that mess. We needed someone like you around here." I smiled, shook his hand, and told him the same thing I'd told everyone else. I wasn't trying to be the hero. I was just trying to protect my home, same as you. Still, word got out. Local news stations picked up the story. HOA president sentenced for towing federal Jeep was the headline. I got a call from a podcast producer asking if I'd be willing to share my side. I said no. The story was finished. Karen got her justice. The neighborhood got its peace. And I got back to work, quietly and efficiently, like always. But something had changed inside me too. For so long I had kept work and life separate. After this incident, I realized that sometimes the lines blur, and you have to stand your ground, just as an officer, but as a neighbor, a homeowner, a citizen. I started spending more time at home, not just passing through. I showed up to meetings, met people, had real conversations. I wasn't just undercover anymore. I was a part of the place I lived in. Sometimes, neighbors still ask me if I think Karen will try anything when she gets out. I tell them not unless she wants to end up back inside. They laugh, but we all know when someone like that loses their power, they rarely get it back. Life moved on, but the message remained: no one, not even a self-important HOA president, gets to be above the law. If you enjoyed this true neighborhood showdown, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more shocking stories. You're watching Bright Reality, where real stories shine brighter than fiction.